Welcome to Taming Disaster with Drones for Good podcast, presented by Aeros, part of GE Aviation, with additional financial support from First Eyes and Pix4D. Tune in for in-depth interviews, one-of-a-kind perspectives, and insightful conversations with industry leaders who are using drones to help prepare for, respond to, and recover from complex emergencies and major disasters around the world. And now, from the Airt Studios in Miami, Florida, the heart of Hurricane Alley, here is your host, Christopher Todd.
Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Taming Disaster, Drones for Good. We have another blockbuster episode this week. No doubt that drones are making some substantial impacts around the world in many different ways. We're seeing public safety agencies, NGOs, academia, all types of organizations are now turning to unmanned aircraft systems to start performing a variety of really exciting missions and how they go about their business and how they accomplish objectives. And one of those organizations is the United Nations, the World Food Program, which are now exploring the use of unmanned systems for a wide variety of missions. So this week we have two guests for you. We have Patrick McKay, who's the regional UAS coordinator at the UN World Food Program. Patrick, hello, welcome to the program.
Thanks very much for having me, Chris.
And we also have Matthias Boyd, who is the UAS service manager at the UN World Food Program. Matthias, welcome.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for having us.
No, we're really glad to have you guys aboard. It's going to be exciting to spend a little bit of time here to learn how the UN and the World Food Program are using drones for good. For those who listen to the podcast, they know I always start out. I like to go back and kind of see where it all began. So, Patrick, let's start with you. I'd like to kind of explore how you first got involved with unmanned systems and drones, and how did that lead into what you're doing today with the World Food Program? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So I've always had a bit of an aviation interest. I used to fly paragliders and powered paragliders for quite a few years. I had little toy drones in the early teens. And then in 2017, WFP got some funding from the Belgian government to build up skills in the national disaster management agencies of a number of different regions. And they were looking for somebody who could help run that program. And I was luckily in the right place at the right time, and I stuck my hand up. And so it's been since 2017, we've been working for drones, and it's been great.
Wow. So what types of drones have you been using? I mean, have you been building your own, or have you been using off-the-shelf equipment?
So I started building my own quite a few years ago. I was on the RC groups and looking at how the guys were taking apart Nintendo Wii controllers to build drones. They never worked very well. So when I started releasing drones, I kind of saw that as the easy way to go. And the drones were great quality. They could do pretty much everything we wanted to do. For WFP, we've been sticking mostly with commercial drones. So it's a mix of multi-rotors, a lot of DJIs, some fixed-wing drones, EBs, and parrots. But I would say up to now, most of the work we do is actually covered with your sort of commercial range of DJI drones. And we are looking into moving into the VTOL drones in future, so we can do some long-range BVLOS type flying.
All right. Well, that sounds pretty exciting. Matthias, let's go over to you. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got started in unmanned systems?
Yeah, sure. It was end of 2016. I was living in Malawi, and UNICEF started transporting blood samples with drones for babies under 5 to do HIV tests. So to send blood samples from a local clinic to a laboratory, a national laboratory. And basically it got so much media attraction that they needed a program manager to help with the project. And UNICEF hired me, and that's how I started, from knowing nothing from drones into becoming a drone certified FAA Part 107.
Wow, that's amazing. So what were you doing before you were hired by UNICEF?
I was working in a village doing community outreach. So basically just living the life in Malawi and working wherever I could to assist in communities.
Okay, and my understanding, both of you are based in Africa right now. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm in Johannesburg in the regional office for Southern Africa.
And I am in Nairobi for the Eastern Africa office.
All right. And originally, where are each of you from? Are you from Africa?
I'm a South African, yeah. So this is, I'm basically at home while I work here.
Okay.
And I'm from Belgium, but I fell in love with Malawi, and that's where I stayed for 5 years. And now I'm still in the region, and I love it.
That is so cool. That's very cool. So how long have each of you been with the UN or World Food Program?
For me, it's been a very long time. I joined them in 2004, so it's been about 16 years now.
Wow. Okay.
And I've been 3 years with UNICEF, and now I just moved to WFP. I'm with WFP for 8 months now.
All right. So Patrick, 16 years, Matthias, about 6 months. All right. So I should tell everyone, I got hooked up with you guys because, of the initiative that you're looking at using drones in different ways. And, I want to get into talking about the working group a little bit later. But first, I think we need to get a kind of a fundamental understanding of how is the World Food Program looking at using these systems today. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Patrick, let's start with you.
Sure. I think we've basically covered this at some point anyway with Matthias. So WFP is looking at using drones in 3 key areas. The first is obviously cargo, which is run by our aviation division. They're talking about everything from delivering vaccines, so very light cargo, up to multiple tons of food. The aviation division's got lots of experience there. We've also got an aviation safety division, which is the third pillar of drones in WFP, and they oversee everything to make sure everything's safe. For us on the tech side, we're going to be using drones for data collection purposes, so imagery, LiDAR, detecting cell phones under rubble, that sort of thing. But we're also going to be using drones for connectivity. So if you arrive in a city like we got to Beira last year and the whole thing's been wiped out by the cyclone, you've got no comms. We're talking about putting up comms with tethered drones. So basically creating a small cell phone tower we can carry into a city in a couple of suitcases. I think those are the primary reasons I see. Matthias?
Yeah, maybe I would like to go first a bit more about the World Food Program's core mission, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Please.
WFP is the food assistance branch of the United Nations. The World Food Program assists 100 million people in 88 countries. And in fact, on any given day, WFP has 5,600 trucks, 30 ships, and nearly 100 planes on the move, delivering food and other assistance to those in most need. And responding to emergencies and saving lives and livelihoods remains at the heart of WFP's operations, especially as humanitarian needs become increasingly complex. And this year we were even the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize for 2020. And that's because of its efforts to provide food assistance in areas of conflict and to prevent the use of hunger as a weapon of war and conflict. But maybe more about how WFP got involved into drones. WFP was founded in 1961, but since 2003, WFP has the mandate to provide air services to the humanitarian community worldwide. It's called UNHAS, United Nations Humanitarian Air Service. And at one point during the pandemic, for example, WFP was the biggest airline in the world still operating. We carried nearly 20,000 passengers and 50,000 cubic meters of cargo in just 3 months. So that was something really sufficient.
So at what point did the WFP say, okay, we're running all these manned aircraft, we need to start looking at unmanned systems? Do you have a sense on kind of when that conversation started happening internally within the organization?
So that really started in 2016 with the support of the Belgian government, where we got a fund to organize workshops in 9 countries with 300 people participating from over 100 organizations. And the training package included 3 modules. Let's coordinate, a workshop to strengthen coordination between various national stakeholders to coordinate better in emergency situations. A module called Let's Map, a practical classroom course on processing data obtained from drones, and Let's Fly, a hands-on flight exercise. And in 2019, the different disasters at Mozambique, and WFP was also deployed there, but I think Patrick will tell more about this later.
Okay, and so Patrick, you've been with WFP for 16 years. And tell me again, what year was when you started kind of engaging in the unmanned system side? Was that 2016?
So I wasn't involved until 2017. The workshops were sort of scattered around the world, and there wasn't quite one identified for Southern Africa. But one of the other countries had a bit of a conflict problem, so they decided to look for a country that had a lot of natural disasters and no conflict at the time, and Mozambique was chosen for that. And being in my region, I got involved then.
Okay. Got it. So, here in the United States, when we look at emergencies and we look at disasters, we tend to look at kind of a holistic approach of emergency management, looking at the preparedness side, the mitigation, protection, prevention to the extent possible, before we get into the response and eventually the recovery. Can you tell me a little bit about how WFP is looking at disasters? I mean, do you guys take the same approach, or how do you approach the entire ecosystem surrounding disaster management?
I think it's in a very similar way. A lot of people think of WFP as sort of an emergency-only organization, but I think a huge chunk of our work actually comes in preparedness. So we've got an ERP division, emergency preparedness division. We also work a lot in development. So it's a country that wouldn't perhaps be in an emergency. We run programs that would help develop the economy. So we do try and go for a sort of an end-to-end solution. I think WFP is the biggest humanitarian organization in the world at the moment. So a lot of the work happens where I might not know all the details, but we do try to keep things covered from end to end, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really one of the really amazing powers of drones that a lot of people don't discover at first, but there are so many different use cases, and especially for, combating hunger, for disaster management, for conflict resolution, whether it's monitoring the movement of people or goods or supplies, mapping floodplains, agricultural uses. Can you guys tell me a little bit about the different types of missions that you've been running to date, as far as on the visual imagery side, and we can talk about the cargo side a little bit later?
Sure. Look, I can talk about a couple of the examples in my region. So we've been involved with Mozambique right from the beginning, from 2017. Matthias was talking about those workshops, let's coordinate, let's fly, and let's map. But we started actually in Mozambique with let's coordinate. And what we try to do with that is we try and build up the skills in the national disaster management agencies to actually manage the use of drones in an emergency. So this happened many, many years ago. And then following that, we had the pilot training where we taught people just how to fly drones, how to do it safely, what to consider. And then after that was the mapping training, where we built up their skills in how to process the data they've collected during flights into maps and digital elevation models. Another of the projects we ran last year was the mapping of the Lukungu floodplain. The Lukungu Valley is a river, at least is a river that floods relatively frequently. And what we decided to do was to get ahead of the potential disaster in this case by mapping the entire river's floodplain wherever there was a population living, so that we could draw up these really high quality digital elevation models. And what they let us do is they can tell the national disaster management agencies, who's going to be in trouble, how many people will be in trouble for a different level of the water, who should we evacuate first, and where's the safest place to put them. So I think that was one of the great projects we did. The Lukungu didn't flood this year. We were very fortunate. But now we've got the data if it happens anytime in the future.
Matthias, this question is over to you. One of the things that we've found here in the United States is that there's a pretty extensive learning curve to educate end users of the data products, whether it be an incident commander, an emergency commander, government officials, to really get them up to speed and to understand what the power of unmanned aircraft systems bring to the table. And they think it's just pretty pictures until they actually get to look at some of these mapping products and some of the 3D models and the different data products you can produce. What strategies have you found to be effective to help build awareness and educate people in Africa and beyond about what you can do for them using drones for good?
Yeah, what I have seen quite often in the past is that people want to fly the drones and they don't think what the data are going to be later. But actually, it's the data which are central and how we visualize the data and how we use the data. So what we really learned from the past is that we have to teach people how to use the data, and that we also have to engage in machine learning and AI to analyze data quicker in a response.
Patrick, any additional thoughts on that and anything you've seen from your perspective?
So look, one of the things we do is we work very closely with government. We see them as a partner and not really somebody we're handing over equipment and tools to. And we built up really good partnerships with a number of the countries in the region. And when we're working with them, we've got different types of experts. We've got people who can do GIS work in the background. They've got people who can do GIS. So we try and link the people up with people with similar skill sets. But what I found was actually learning by doing seems to have the biggest effect. And during the cyclones, we had 2 cyclones in quite a short space of time. And we really saw a massive increase in the ability of our partners in the National Disaster Management Agencies of Mozambique on how the response worked for the first cyclone, where we were working together on a kind of a mentoring style of work, to the second one where the Mozambique government was so highly skilled they could basically have handled it without us needing to be there.
Yeah, I mean, we've kind of taken a similar approach here in the States. I mean, we tend to try to integrate into emergency management exercises and conduct demonstrations with different stakeholders and partners to really help them understand what we can bring to the table for the different types of scenarios that they might be running. But you're absolutely right. It's all about establishing the right partnerships and building that trust level, because a lot of these folks are busy and they're getting approached by different organizations and different solution providers who are making promises to them. But it's when you actually kind of can come through and demonstrate a return on investment, whether that investment is their time or capital or just their resources, they tend to build that trust a little bit, and that's worked really well for us.
And if you can really prove that you have something to offer to them. For example, if you can tell them this many roofs have went off during this cyclone, you need so many tarps, that's something they need, something they actually can use in the field.
Yeah, there's so many use cases, and that's a great point, Matthias. The other thing we see is when we show them one scenario, their imagination starts kind of becoming very active, and they say, "Wait a minute, we could use it for this, and we could use it for this." And so they start thinking about the use cases, and all of a sudden it's like a whole new world is opening up for them, and that's been the amazing thing, because historically, as I'm sure you all know as well as anyone running the fleet that WFP has, manned aviation is really expensive, and one of the biggest value propositions for drones is just the cost benefit ratio to get these units in the hands of people who never have really operated aircraft. But that's also that's another challenge. So how do you train your pilots when they haven't, if they've got no history with drones, or when you go into a village and they've never really used drones before? What's the strategy you employ to kind of get them up to speed with running a professional aviation program?
We actually start small. So we start teaching guys with really small drones, your Sparks and your Mavic Minis, but that's just to get them sort of comfortable controlling the drones. What comes later on is actually how you sort of plan your flights, how you plan coverage of areas, how you integrate with aviation, and make sure you've got airspace separation. That we actually work on in our coordination training. We try and bring together the local CAA, National Disaster Management Agencies. It's open to all the NGOs and UN agencies in the country as well. And by getting enough sort of skilled people around the table and getting them working together, we found that to have sort of the biggest impact.
Villages, Chris, and flying in a village is totally different than flying when you're training, because it affects so many crowds that the landing is always a challenge.
Oh, I can imagine. I mean, I'm lucky. I'm in Florida, so it's pretty flat here, and we've got a lot of water. But flying in different types of terrain with mountains and valleys is something that Florida unmanned remote pilots don't have a lot of experience with.
Yeah, what Matthias is trying to say is if you've never flown in a village, you won't know what it's like trying to land a drone with 200 kids sort of trying to reach your phone and trying to reach the controller at the same time. It is quite a challenge.
I was going to ask you guys about that, because I know what it's like when we go into a neighborhood here and we've got kids and families and people coming up wanting to look over our shoulder, and it becomes a distraction. You want to accommodate them, you want to show them, and kind of be a good neighbor and educate them on what we're doing, but at the same time, it can become at some point a safety risk for the actual flight operation. So how do you handle that situation?
We've tried a couple of different techniques. We've used some police tape where we can mark off areas. We've had police and military escorts. What sometimes helps is we actually put a decoy drone out, so the kids have got something to go and stare at, to go and look while the main drone is actually doing the operation. And that's worked quite well, to be honest.
That's brilliant. So you guys are using a decoy drone to attract public attention so you can conduct the actual flight operation unhindered. That's a new one. I haven't heard that before.
Usually you also have a dedicated person talking to the communities what it is about and what we are doing, so that you don't have to do that as a pilot in command.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Matthias, because what we've kind of learned here as well is, some people are really open to learning about the technology. They're excited about it. They want to know how it works and watch it. And then there's other folks who are kind of paranoid about it. They want to know why you're flying this around their house and what you're doing. And so we found that taking those few minutes to kind of educate them and show them exactly what we're doing and how it works and explain why we're there goes a long way to alleviating any concerns on especially on the negative side about what we're doing operating in their neighborhood.
In my days at UNICEF, we opened the Humanitarian drone corridor. So that was a testing space where drones would come and test for humanitarian use cases. So we knew that we would fly there quite often. And we made sure that a lot of areas around the takeoff space, the aerodrome, had gone through community sensitization. And we did that through theater shows and drone demonstrations. So we really used local solutions to explain what a drone was.
So tell us a little bit more about that. Where was that corridor? How big was it? And is it still in operation?
It's still in operation. It's in Malawi. It's 5,000 square kilometers big. It's a circular corridor. And it's open for everyone to test humanitarian use cases. We had people just testing the technology of their drone because they couldn't test it in the countries of manufacturing. But you also had people checking stagnant waters for mosquitoes, or connectivity use cases, or mapping for food assets, or mapping schools, or drops for blood deliveries. So different things.
Wow, that's impressive. That sounds a lot like the FAA's IPP, which just kind of wrapped up here in the United States, and they're moving into the next phase, which they're calling Beyond. How many drone corridors are there in Africa for where people can go do things like that?
In Africa, I don't really know. I know there is one in Kazakhstan, one in Vanuatu, and there might be one coming up in Namibia, so that would be the second for Africa.
Mozambique is also looking to establish one. They're planning one up sort of towards the north of the country.
Okay, and is that run by you guys in World Food Program, or is that a different entity?
It's going to be done by the government themselves, but WFP's obviously got quite a big interest there. When we talk a little bit about cargo, that's one of the areas where they're looking at doing cargo operations.
Okay, understood. So how does WFP coordinate with all the different civil aviation authorities in the different areas of Africa and other parts of the world where you're operating?
Look, our key partner in most of these countries and most of these areas is normally the National Disaster Management Agency. But we try and work through them to reach the civil aviation authorities. And we found actually that they're generally very well connected with the civil aviation authorities. So it's quite a good route in.
All right, that's interesting. So you're using the Disaster Management Agency connects you with the Civil Aviation Agency. You've got a nice warm introduction, and what have there been any big hurdles or stumbling blocks to developing those relationships, or does it go pretty easy?
Yeah, look, the one big thing to add there is obviously we've got an aviation and an aviation safety division as well. So, before we actually go anywhere, we try and sort of ping them and see if they know anyone, if they've got any decent connections for us to make use of. But up until now, it's mostly been the National Disaster Management Agencies. It's been quite smooth, to be honest. mostly, mostly in the countries we've worked, they've actually had a very good relationship to begin with. So it hasn't actually caused too many issues for us.
I also think because WFP, with the mandate of being UNHAS, the United Nations Humanitarian Air Service, they have quite a good name all over the world. And that gives us a strong mandate to work with drones as well.
Yep. Okay. I can understand that. One thing we see here in the United States is obviously manned pilots have so much experience. They've got to complete a certain number of hours, checklist, trust, that when there's drones in the air, even if the drones are flown by pilots or remote pilots of the same agency, there might not be that same level of trust because remote pilots don't have as strenuous of a training certification process that the manned aviators do. Have you seen anything similar internally with World Food Program, with your manned pilots and your unmanned pilots, or are the operations just kind of so separated where it's really a non-issue?
So generally, it's quite separated. Where it becomes more of a challenge is obviously in an emergency when the airspace is actually really busy. But fortunate to have, again, our aviation safety team on the ground. And their main job is to make sure that things happen safely and that there's a balance between production and risk. So what we did for the cyclone responses was they basically set a blanket rule that's manned aviation is at 500 feet or above, and unmanned aviation is at 400 feet and below. And anything we wanted to do within a 5-kilometer radius of the airport, we had to get clearance before the flights. And it worked. It worked very well. It went very smoothly, in fact.
That's super interesting as well, because we had a similar experience when Hurricane Michael came ashore in the Florida Panhandle 2 years ago. And the FAA in advance put up a temporary flight restriction allowing basically unmanned flights at 200 feet AGL and below, and manned at 400 and above. So we had, I believe it was a 200-foot separation, but it made it really easy because as a remote pilot working the disaster, you knew you had that 200-foot ceiling that you could operate in. And what made it even more smart and practical was that all the mobile communication networks were basically down in the area where the hurricane made the landfall. So people didn't have typically the ability to log onto a computer or a mobile device or make a phone call and see what the airspace restrictions might be at that particular time because the networks were out. So knowing you had the 200 feet was just really valuable for the response operation.
Yeah, that must have been comfortable, yeah.
Yeah. Now the flip side of that was obviously if you didn't have your maps cached in your flight control software, you were going to have some trouble possibly. And then getting the data from where it needed to go to the end user, or from the aircraft, from the field to the end user, became problematic. Have you been dealing with those types of situations as well?
Yeah, so it's quite common for us not to have any data when we're actually mapping the field. So one of the things we learned to do quite early on was to plan our flights or plan our locations at least the day before we're going flying. So we mostly do that on Google Earth, and we'll plot out the polygon and we'll send the polygon to everyone who's going to be flying that day. And the nice thing is when you import those polygon files into something like Pix4D, it actually draws a giant red block or a red polygon in your Pix4D client. So you can plan your flights literally without needing any data on the ground. One of the issues when you try and cache your maps is that very often, if there is a signal, but it might not be very good, it'll actually wipe out your cache and try and pull a new one. So we learned very early on that we can't rely on that, and we need to plan. The bonus of planning is we can also tell our aviation safety contacts exactly where we're going to be flying the next day, and they can really set out a NOTAM for all the pilots.
Yep, got it. Very smart. And how are you keeping how are you maintaining communications in the field with your different flight teams during a disaster response?
So initially we had no comms because the whole networks were down. I think it took us about 2 weeks to get some sort of mobile comms back into Beira. We're occasionally we've got a sat phone on somebody, but generally we try and plan enough that we won't need to communicate too much on the ground. When we're flying in very remote areas, sometimes the only way to get there is actually by helicopter. And very often the helicopter pilots would be the ones relaying messages for us because there's literally no way to get comms in and out otherwise.
Gotcha. And are those typically World Food Program pilots or other types of pilots?
Yeah, so the helicopters would belong to the World Food Program. They'd be flying a whole range of different missions. And generally, when there's either a big need or if there's space available, and a helicopter or drone pilot would go on, and that would get us basically into the most needed areas.
Okay, very good. So let's talk a little bit about the cargo side, because I think that's a side that is starting to emerge. I mean, there's a whole new horizon of unmanned aircraft operations that are going to be taking place as these systems get stronger. Flight endurance improves with battery power and lift, and the ability to really haul critical goods and supplies into these areas is, I think, going to be a game changer. What are you seeing? What are you testing? What kind of experience does World Food Program have with those types of operations at this point?
Maybe first it's important to mention that there is a separation and work between two divisions in WFP, the aviation division and the IT division. And the aviation division looks into the future of delivering food with drones and other delivering goods, while the IT division is looking at data collection during an emergency and other use cases. And Patrick and I belong to the IT division.
Oh, okay. So you guys are specifically focused on like the mapping products and visual imagery, and the other division, the aviation division, is really hauling and transporting the food at this point.
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. So is there any crossover as far as testing and exploring capabilities at this point, or is it just too soon in the game to go down that path?
It's probably a little bit too soon. So where we're at the moment is we're drafting common regulations for everybody in WFP. So that's one of the things we all work together, aviation, IT, as well as aviation safety. I do know they've been talking to a number of different players. We've had a couple of presentations on the types of aircraft they're looking at. And they're looking at sort of the full spectrum. So from, like I said, from vaccines to multiple tons of food.
Okay. Well, and I know a big area of interest based on some of our previous conversations, and you mentioned it earlier, is the mobile connectivity, to really use unmanned aircraft systems to restore cellular mobile service in areas that have been hit by disasters. That's something that is falling within your group, or that's kind of a joint effort?
So anything related to connectivity obviously falls under the IT division. It is something we're looking into. We're actually just getting started off now with something we call our flying cow, which is basically it's not going to be a tethered cell phone network at this stage, because often we need to get something up and running quickly in an area, and to put up a drone carrying some cell phone equipment, you need to think of things like spectrum licensing, the use of SIM cards. But we've got a couple of good standby partners. One of them is Ericsson Response, and they've got some really high-powered Wi-Fi radios that we're talking to them about. And it looks like we're going to be able to mount one on our flying car, which will cover a 2-kilometer radius, which is about 12 square kilometer areas. So it's something we could have really used during Cyclone Ida. 3 of those would have covered the whole city of Beira, basically.
Maybe you have to say what a flying cow is, because I think people might be wondering.
Okay, so we call it a flying cow. It's connectivity on wings. So anything that flies with connectivity, we call it a cow. The name seemed to stick quite early on, and people seem to like it, so we're keeping it.
Yeah, no, and we've seen it here in the States as well. I know AT&T and possibly Verizon have done some testing with it as well as not just drones, but also lighter than air tethered aerostat systems.
Yeah, no, look, it makes total sense to be able to pack a cell phone tower into a couple of suitcases and fly it into an emergency location. I think it's going to really change the way we do our connectivity following emergencies.
Yeah, and AT&T and FirstNet have a new dirigible. It's like a very large aerostat that they bring in for major disasters that'll go several hundred feet in the air, if not higher, to hoist equipment. And obviously, it's got to be a really large balloon envelope with a lot of lift gas to be able to get the equipment up where it needs to be. But it's really amazing to see the evolution of these systems, and it really, if you lose comms out there, it can really frustrate and hamper the response effort. And I think a lot of folks don't realize how important that is, to have good communications.
One of the other projects I quite like is Google Loon, and it's one of the agencies one of the organizations we're thinking of working with. Obviously, it's a completely different thing from a UAS. It's an ultra-high altitude UAS. But I was very impressed to see how well they can actually steer sort of an unmotored balloon and keep it in a really small area. It's very impressive.
And so when you're looking at the cow solutions, are these typically tethered solutions?
So at the moment we're looking at tethered solutions, but we're not ruling out other types of solutions. So, if somebody comes up with a blimp that can carry the same radio and can cover a city, that's something we're going to look into, because when a city's offline, it's not just the responders that need comms, it's the community as well. And if you can't cover enough of a city, at least with a mobile communications balloon or drone, you can for very small periods of the day cover everybody, which means that at least they can get messages in and out for that small section of the day.
That's so important for people who are not in the city but have friends or family or business associates, and they just want to get a quick status report to make sure that, are you okay? Is the business still there? Is the home still standing? And
so one of the mandates of the Emergency Telecoms Group, which WFP is leading, is actually something called Services for Communities, and it is literally just that. What can we do to help communities? So we've done things like set up hotspots in different villages, and we've repaired radio stations so that messages can get out to the rest of the community. And I think providing sort of connectivity over large areas, I think it's going to be almost services for communities on steroids in the future.
So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the UAS Working Group that you both are actively involved in and have established. It's been a great experience. I know the Airborne International Response Team is pleased to be working with you as a member of this group, and it's been just fascinating to see the number of different people from around the world who are now actively involved in this. Can you tell us a little bit about the group, how it got started, and what the goals and objectives are?
Yeah, so the World Food Program has set up and continues growing a technical working group. It started on the next tranche of funding we received from the UK government to really strengthen the work on drones, and one of that was to create a technical working group, really to build a community of humanitarians around the use of unmanned aircraft systems. And the key function is to focus on specific challenges to the integration of UAS in the humanitarian space. We divided the technical working group into 4 thematic areas: ethics, regulations and operations, imagery and connectivity. And we divided it to allow for subject matter experts to focus on relevant areas of interest and relevance to their specialization. And what we plan to do with the findings of these thematic areas is to make them public and to share them with the broader humanitarian community.
And about how many participants do you have involved in the working groups at this point?
At this point, we have 56 members from UN agencies, academia, NGOs, a little bit the private sector, but also governments.
And that's from all over the world at this point?
Yeah, stretching from San Francisco to Bangkok.
Wow. Okay. So it's amazing to be on these calls because you see all these people who are just there's so much energy, and they're really excited about the use of these systems and what the future holds and what the technology might bring to the table. Any issues in coordinating that many people? Because I know it can be difficult with span of control as these groups become larger and larger, to kind of keep everyone flowing in the same direction. So have you kind of thought through kind of where you want to take it? And I know you're looking at dividing it in, you mentioned the subgroups that you're dividing into, but ultimately, what are you looking to accomplish over the next year or so with these groups?
I think our biggest challenge now is the time zones. Everyone wants to be part of it, and it's hard to choose a time zone and have people left out. But what we really need to do is to really be specific and create specific terms of reference and know the direction what we're going to, and maybe start small and keep growing.
And English is the language I've noticed that's commonly used. Has that been a challenge for you with certain groups that want to participate but might not speak English?
Not this far. Like even our regions from South America or the regions from West Africa, where they speak Spanish or French, they're good enough in English to understand.
So there's probably some people listening to us right now that want more information on this working group and would like to either learn more about it or know how they might be able to get involved. What would you tell them and would be a good way for them to learn more about it?
So they could reach out to wfp.drones@wfp.org.
All right, wfp.drones@wfp.org to learn more about the World Food Program UAS Working Group and how they can get involved. And does that include solution providers and commercial entities, or are you just looking for NGOs and humanitarian organizations at this point?
We're really targeting the humanitarian community at this point.
Okay, so maybe if they're a commercial solution provider and they want to get involved or get you more information, they should reach out to you or Patrick directly.
Discuss, yeah.
Okay. All right. So as we get into the final minutes here and closing thoughts, I'd love to kind of get your final thoughts and any information that you want to leave with the audience. So Patrick, let's go over to you. What would you like the audience to know that I might have missed or we didn't cover?
Look, I think we've covered pretty much everything, but the way we see it, drones are going to change pretty much every industry around the world, and the humanitarian sector is one of them. What we need to hope now is that we sort of have realistic regulations which let us basically take advantage of this without providing too many hindrances. And I think it's going to improve the lives of so many people around the world if we can actually use sort of this technology to move forward in our emergency responses, but also in preparedness and development activities.
Very well said. Matthias, over to you. Final thoughts?
Yeah, I would like to echo Patrick and also say that WFP will expand its UAS activities in delivery, connectivity, and data operations. And these three functional areas will be developed into common humanitarian services over the next few years with the support of partners and core funding. And pre-positioning drones and localizing services will continue to be guiding priorities throughout the project.
All right. Well, I think you're both doing amazing work, and I really appreciate you sharing it with us here today on Taming Disaster Drones for Good. I want to stay in touch with both of you and get you back here on the program in a couple months so you can update us on the progress of the working group and the different projects that the World Food Program is working on. Does that sound good?
Sounds great.
Yeah.
All right. Well, my thanks to both of you for joining us on this episode of Taming Disaster Drones for Good. Patrick McKay, Matthias Boyd from the World Food Program. We'll see you next time on another edition of Taming Disaster Drones for Good.
Thank you for listening to Taming Disaster, a production of AIRT, the world's leading nonprofit organization supporting drones for good. Learn more about us online at airt.ngo. And be sure to tune in to our public safety focused podcast, Drone Responders, hosted by Charles Werner.